known Carol for a long time. She's been very supportive of my work. So I appreciate her and her staff inviting me to come and speak here. And it's an honor to be able to tell you my story because I know a lot of you have stories too, but I get to share mine for the moment. And so I wanted to do a little survey of the audience and find out more about who you are. How many artists do we have? Wow, I'd say mostly artists. How many textile artists? Not as many, but good. How many screen printers? Oh. And maybe a little bit. But you've screen printed, haven't you?
A little bit.
No? Okay.
Not too much.
Okay. So, because I go through the printing process because it's so unusual, but it's even more unusual if you're a screen printer and you've been doing it in the traditional way, and so you can really appreciate what it does. So. So anyway, this is my studio, and it's in Sebastopol, California, which is near Santa Rosa, which is 60 miles north of San Francisco. And we're towards the ocean, so we get the ocean about 12 miles from the ocean. And one year it snowed. It doesn't usually snow, but this year it did, so it makes it look like I live in Minnesota, but I don't. So, and that's my studio on the upper level of that building out there. And I told my husband I wanted lots of light, so we put in those skylights, and it's a wonderful studio. I feel lucky to have that space. Our house is it's just across a field, so we live very close to it. One thing about doing these talks is it makes me think a lot about why I do what I do. And I think about something that Carol Westphal, who was married to Ed Rossbach, if some of you know that heritage way back when. She said one of the things that she thinks about is how lucky we are to be creative, and that it can affect all parts of our lives, not just artistically. And that we are the lucky ones who find that and make it a part of our life, because there are a lot of people who don't ever find it and don't appreciate it, don't understand it. So I feel like we're lucky because of that. And then I feel like it affects all areas of my life. It's not just in the studio, but it can be out in the garden, or it can be cooking, or it can be creatively solving a problem, that comes up in relationships or in everything we do. So you can apply it to these other areas. And but one thing about choosing to be an artist is that there are these other challenges that come with the territory, like how to get your work out there. Or even if you want to get your work out there, some people make a choice not to do that. And how to market your work, and and how to make a living from it if you're thinking about making a living. And so at times it's taken more of a dominance in my life being an artist, and then there are other times where it sort of subsides and I don't go into the studio very much. So this is the entrance to a building I'm going to show you later on. I grew up in Berkeley. I'm going to start right here from the beginning. And And I grew up in Berkeley, but I was born in Oakland. I brought to Berkeley right away. And that's me at a couple months, I think. I don't remember actually, too long ago. And I lived in this house for all of my growing up. And my stepmother, who is 90 years old and an artist, lives there still. And she is still creative. I'll talk about her a little bit more. But I spent all of my growing up there. And then I spent it with my brother, who this is one of the 50s Christmas cards. And my mother, and this is my first introduction to textiles and sewing. My mother loved to make the look-alike outfits. Remember those from the 50s? She was totally into that, but she didn't like sewing otherwise. It was just the look-alikes, and that was the extent of her sewing. My father, though, he was, and I should say my mother was a second grade school teacher for most of, she was a working mom. She was not home a lot. And my father was home a lot because he had his workshop in the basement of that house that you just saw. He got his start very early on. He knew he wanted to pursue wood turning when he was in his 20s. He worked for a furniture factory, or even before, I think it was in his late high school years. And he worked in a furniture factory turning parts for furniture. And so he had, he sort of pursued that, you'll see, up until he died. He was turning wood until maybe a year or two before he died. So he kept at it, and he knew very early on that he wanted to do this. He was in Indiana. They were of the Brethren faith, and which was considered one of the peace churches. So when he was considering World War II, he applied for a conscientious objector status, which he got, and he ended up working in forestry camps. That was the alternative service for conscientious objectors at the time. There I am in one of his bowls. So he found a lathe at one of these conscientious objector camps, and he started turning bowls. And he would come to the Bay Area and sell his work on his off time. And then after the war ended, he and some other friends bought that house that I showed you, and he set up his studio in the bottom of the house. And so I always grew up around wood and had that environment, as well as my father had lots of stories to tell us about where he got his woods, because he used a lot of exotic woods. And he got some woods from Hearst Castle, from the building of Hearst Castle, and Playland at the beach in San Francisco. They used cocobolo ball bearings for some of the amusement rides. And when they no longer used the cocobolo, they had all this stock, and he got the leftovers. So, and Hearst Castle, it was teak for building the castle. So, and those were outstanding stories, but he always had other stories to tell us. This is some of his work. He was a steady guy, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and he did wood turning, which is a very repetitive process if you know anything about wood turning. But he would always have a new bowl to show me, something wonderful to tell me whenever I'd visit him in the shop in the basement of the house. And I feel like I kind of carry on for him in my work, that, you know, I too found my calling early on, and I carry on in his spirit. I have one of my favorite things is not the bowls, but a picture of his hand working as he's turning a bowl. And my stepmother came into the picture around 1970. They were married, and she was a well-known weaver, and she was one of the craftspeople that my father and I would visit before they knew each other, of each other. My father took me around to a lot of people who were making a living doing ceramics and glass and jewelry, weaving during the 50s, which is, you know, before a lot of people really were thinking a lot about crafts, which came more into our consciousness in the 60s and 70s and on. So I got that early bringing up. So my father and my stepmother collaborated. My stepmother is Kay Sakamachi, and she is mostly known for her weavings, but here she cast paper on the outside of my father's bowls. So the gray bowls are cast, you can see cast hornet's nest paper. And then paper on the orange one behind the scooped bowl is mulberry paper. And so so I'm switching here to serve my story now. That was serve my heritage, I should say. And I first got my interest in 1965 when I went to England for a year. My mother was an exchange school teacher, and my brother and I went to school there for an entire school year. And they gave me the option of taking cookery or embroidery, and I thought, oh, I'll take cookery. And they said, oh, it's full. And then they gave me embroidery, which turned out to be the most creative class I ever took through all of my education, because this teacher, she approached it as an art class. And in fact, at the end of the year, we had to all take exams at the time, and the exam was in art, not in embroidery. And I really thought we were going to sit there and stitch with little embroidery hoops, but it turned out to be drawing kind of with the stitching of the sewing machine. Free motion, they call it now, if you're familiar with drawing with the sewing machine. And she taught us different techniques. This is sort of a lace technique, which I actually came back to in my later work using this same idea. And this is layers. It's like a little vignette that I did. This is actually college work, but it started from a sample I did when I was back there in 1965. And so then I went all the way through high school and into college, focusing on textiles because I was hooked. I did a lot of, this is a large quilt, it's 6 feet by 7 feet, and it's, and I liked quilting, but I wanted to do something very different with it that, you know, wasn't your traditional patchwork and whatnot. So I did some historic sort of research, and I came up with shadow quilting, which is basically you've got your backing, if you can imagine these layers, backing, batting, which gives the puffiness to the quilt. And then on top of that, I arranged felt pieces, colored craft felt, you know, like wool felt. And then on top of that, I put a sheer layer of fabric to hold it all together. and stitched around those felt pieces. And the top is saying, fish float through the trees eating seeds of the sun, which is Lawrence Ferlinghetti poem, part of a poem that he wrote. And so the challenge here, remember that I have a lot of challenges in my life, and the challenge here was to take an old technique and make it modern, to use modern techniques to take it a step further. And then I did a lot of this is machine quilted garment, and it's painted on velveteen, basically. And I was not a painter. I really didn't think I wanted to do painting on fabric, but I did a few pieces here. And after I graduated from college, I did a lot of teaching, and I did these garments and these quilted pieces. And then in 1980, I decided I wanted to go back to England. It was such a transformative time. I thought, oh, I'll see if that'll do it again. What else can I do here? So then I spent a whole school year again there at the University of London Goldsmiths. And there's a embroidery program, what they called embroidery back then. I focused a lot on embroidery, but actually what happened was they taught me a lot about drawing, which I'll go into in just a minute. This is the the Albert Memorial, and I went all the way through the Victoria Albert Museum, room by room by room, just as a challenge to myself, and I did a lot of looking, seeing art, and it really influenced me it influenced a lot of my design. So I did these little embroideries. I consider them like little stage sets, and I did a series of these. They're small, they're only about a foot tall. And the challenge in this case was how to display the textiles. This is freestanding, and the frame is part of the design. So in all of these, in this guy, see, the frame became a sort of a stage for this piece. And then, so I spent a lot of time there because they could talk about drawing and they could show me techniques. I had gone all the way through California College of Arts and Crafts, now California College of the Arts, and I didn't learn to draw. I mean, I had to take drawing, but nobody really instructed me on how to draw. So in England, they talk about drawing and they show you techniques and they explain why things aren't working. So technically, I could get that information more, which influences your design when you know more about drawing. And so I spent a good portion of my time learning to draw while I was there. But they taught me this technique. Every 2 weeks they would go into another field of textiles, and so one of them was screen printing, where they had taken a regular screen print frame and squeegee, and they just arbitrarily painted dies on that screen, and then it would transfer off with one pull of the squeegee. I'm going to go into this in more detail in just a second, but I thought, oh, this is a technique that really interests me, like no color registration, and I never thought I would be a screen printer when I took it in college because of all the toxic stuff that you had to use for screen printing. And so I did manage to get 2 prints out of this this particular screen, but it was sort of uncontrolled design and uncontrolled how many prints you got, and nobody was giving me specific instruction on how to apply the dye to the screen, except that you just do it. So I thought, I'm going to go home and I'm going to do a lot more experimenting, which I did, and then I decided it's important enough to write about this technique, which I did about 4 years later. I wrote a book about the technique, which I am now in the process of rewriting. So the first edition came out in 1984, and then there was a second edition, and now I'm putting out the third edition, basically. And it's so much has changed during that time. And I'm having to go back to the drawing board and rethink some of the materials I used in the process, because you can't get them anymore. Or the services aren't available anymore, like sharpening a squeegee. Nobody does that anymore. They just buy a new one, you know. So anyway, this is a series of slides that show the technique a little bit. And it starts with regular screen printing supplies, which is a screen frame that you see there, which in this case is just artist stretcher bars because it's a small screen. I can use those. And then the fabric I use is a sheer that you hang in windows. You've all seen it. It's behind the heavy curtain, and it's a sheer layer of fabric. It's an even weave, and if you're a screen printer, it's about a 6XX in screen printing terms. And so it uses a frame with the fabric stretched over it. It uses the traditional squeegee, which is that long blade handle, wooden handle with a rubber blade. And then now this is where it really diverges from traditional screen printing, is in that I treat the screen as though it's a piece of stretched fabric, which it is, right? It's stretched on there. And so I am applying a resist to keep, because when I paint the dyes on the screen, it will just want to bleed. And the resist helps hold the dye in place. So I use this glue solution and a jaunting tool to get the glue on in a thin line. And then I paint the concentrated dyes. I'm using fiber reactive dyes, which make a chemical bond with cellulose fiber and silk. And so I paint the screen entirely. After the resist is dry, I paint the screen and it dries. So the screen is entirely dry by the time I'm ready to print. You can see I have a garment outlined on the screen, and the design fits within the garment. I used to do a lot of garments, but not so much anymore. And this is looking through the mesh of the screen, a sort of silhouette, and it's to show that the screen should be open. And you can see in the center it's a little clogged there, but that actually isn't too much. That would open up when I'm ready to print. So you want to keep the mesh open once you've painted something on the screen with the concentrated dyes. If it blocks, then it prevents a clean print. So this is the screen fully painted and dry. I stretch the fabric out on these print boards. I can print up to 36 inches by 45 if I want to, but I pull about a 50 by 24 piece of fabric. I can pull that by myself. The other I have to use what's called a one-arm squeegee to do, and that's an industrial setup, which most people don't have. So the screen has to be blocked off with paper strips, And that area is called a well, where the paper strips are. And the print paste is a traditional print paste for printing on textiles using soda ash and urea to set the dyes and sodium alginate to thicken. And it's not hazardous stuff. You just don't want to eat it, you know, so. But it's, urea is in urine, soda ash is a strong detergent, and sodium alginate is a thickener they use in ice cream and toothpaste and whatnot, so, and then water. It's all mixed together, and then I can add a dye to that mixture if I want to add yet one more color to the print. I can put some dye in the print paste. This is the print paste that's going to be poured across the top of the screen, off the print area, and the squeegee, you can see this long squeegee, the length of the frame, is then behind the print paste, and then once you get everything in place, you quickly squeegee across the screen. You have to have the right angle, the right pressure, everything has to be perfect to get a clean print with one pull of the squeegee. Because if you do more pulls, you're releasing more dye and you won't have as long a print run. So when I do garments, I do 4 to 5 prints. And the color change happens because of the fabric I'm printing on there. Some are ecru and some are white fabrics. So it magically comes off the screen. You would think all those colors would just smear across the screen when you're, but it doesn't happen for some magical reason. It just comes right off. So that's a cool thing. That's why I like this technique so much, is you get all the colors coming off all at once with no color registration. That's wonderful. And then you take the prints and before they dry completely, but so they don't have a lot of moisture in them, you should get it at just that critical point, you roll it up in plastic and keep it damp for 24 hours, and that sets the dye. I don't steam, although you could if you're set up to steam. And then you wash it out, and this is a horrible picture because you should be using gloves when you wash it out. And there it is all. The colors on the screen are much darker and duller than they actually print. This is showing you just the difference in fabric. This is probably the second print in this series on an ecru fabric, and then might even be the last print, I can't remember, but on a absorbent silk that is white, very white silk, and so it takes the dye and the colors very differently because it's so white and absorbent. I did a line of clothing for a long time, for many years. I actually made a living for a while, for a couple years, just doing clothing, but it was a long haul to do clothing because you got to get the right size and the people who like it, and you know, you got to match those things up, and it's hard, and you got to find a place that can sell it for the right price. So these are just a few examples of the work. I like to work in geometrics. I'm still working in geometrics here. But I like abstract and floral and leaves also. You'll see those as we go along. And then I started to do more abstract work using textures and over-dyeing and stamping on the screen. This piece is actually, this is a detail of the piece you just saw. This is kind of borrowing pieces from other, you remember I get 4 or 5 prints, so I have 4 and 5 garments that I cut up so I would borrow. I would take like the piece from the last print and put it with the first print, you know, so you get this difference in the print, even though it would be all one fabric at one point. I was just borrowing pieces from other prints to make up one garment. If you could follow that, that's a hard concept to get across. But oh, here's another example of that, just borrowing pieces. So you get contrast within the garment. And here's a close-up. And that center line, which is black, is a overcast, what's it called? A serger. A serging overcast that made it look like it was corded, but it was actually just sewn on a serger so tightly that it looks corded. So, and these garments were completely lined and interlined to give them body because silk is so thin, or the silks I was printing on were so thin that it gave it body to the piece. And then at the same time I was doing these banner-like wall hangings. This piece is very large. It's like 2 panels put together, one below the other, basically 2 printing sessions. I had 2 very large screens that I could paint part of the design on one and part on another and then merge them together. And this piece in the center has the seam. And so I figured out the challenge was how to hang these. So I harked back to a screen printing. A way of pulling a screen in screen printing is you have a groove around the frame and you put in a cord which stretches the fabric out instead of stapling it to get it tight. So I thought I could use that for mounting a wall hanging. So this is basically taking a square dowel of plastic, putting a groove in it, and then inserting the fabric into that groove and a cord which wedged the fabric into the groove. So you could take out the cord and clean the panel if you needed to. I'm always thinking about cleaning. How are we going to clean these, you know? So if you need to, it could. So, and then the fabric covered the dowel. And in this case, it's not covering the dowel. You can arrange it either way, so it covers or not covers the dowel. And the main thing about these is you have to carefully sew them all in the same, every seam has to be sewn in the same direction. If you're doing any of these, that's a little trick for sewing. But I found these sort of real kind of one-dimensional and flat, and even though you can see I can reverse the image because the dies go all the way through the fabric. That was interesting. So you get a mirror image happening. But I wanted something with more dimension to it and more complexity. So then the challenge was how to get that feeling. And in fabric, I still wanted to do it in fabric. So I thought about lace. I thought about that technique I first showed you, which is cut lace, it's called, where there are islands of fabric that all hang together by a structure. And I was doing it by machine. Traditionally, they do it by hand sewing every edge and every little bar. And it was like, oh, I don't think I'm up for that. I want something a little faster. Well, I knew that when you stiffen fabric, it often keeps it from raveling. So then I thought about, well, what kind of stiffener would suit what I want to do? So then I tried all sorts of things to get to where I'm going. And I finally found this stuff that's horrible to use. It's polyurethane, which they use on wood, incidentally. You don't want to breathe it in and you don't want to smell it, but it really did the trick for me because it wasn't affected by moisture, and it was, it would strengthen the silk. You could take those little bars that I cut there and yank on them, and it still holds all together. It's stronger than paper and stronger than fabric at this point. So, and there are other things you can use to stiffen fabric, but I liked especially this. I would say if you don't want to use something so toxic and horrible, acrylic medium will do it also. So, but this really does make it crispy kind of and hold its shape up, you know, all of which I wanted in this piece when I finally finished, because I wanted the tops to be irregular. And then I thought, you know, and how am I going to hang these pieces so they hang one behind the other? I thought about an acrylic mounting, which I'm going to show you sort of here. It's not a really clear picture, but you can look at these that are on the wall. They're all hung by the same mountings. They Velcro on and off of their mountings for cleaning, right, and for transportation. And you can take a damp cloth to clean these off. You know, they're water. You can even lay them in a bath of water if you need to, but mostly they don't get that dusty. It's mostly the mountings that get dusty because they're horizontal. When you're hanging this way, not as much gets dusty. So, and they just push pin into the wall. These mountings, and they're graduated sizes, so one can hang behind the other, which I use more now than I did when I first began. The whole idea of complexity because of these things, these panels hanging behind each other interests me more.
Now, are you cutting the shapes out?
Mm-hmm.
With an X-Acto?
No, with scissors.
With scissors?
Yeah.
After the polyurethane?
Yeah, after it's stiffened, otherwise it's raveling and it's hard to manage. Yeah, so the order in which I do it is I paint the image on the screen, print it off the screen onto the fabric, wash the fabric, iron it, then I stiffen it, and then I cut it. And I cut it usually with scissors or those little bars that you saw, those thin lines at the first piece I showed you, were cut with a dual-edged X-Acto knife. One swipe and you've got them cut. So I cut those first, I cut those little lines first, and then I cut in between with scissors. So it's all still coming out of one panel of fabric. It's not sort of patched together. It's all one piece of fabric. Well, there are three panels. Can you see the repeat? Yeah. But each panel is one piece. They're not, I don't add to them parts. It all comes out of one piece of fabric. I love to do flowers, but unfortunately flowers don't sell as well. So I just do them every now and then when I feel like I want to hold on to a piece for a while.
That would sell in Hawaii.
Gotta go to Hawaii. Yeah. So you can see this is an older piece. Again, I'm doing those little bars to hold these pieces that all look suspended, right? They look like they're just hanging out there in the world, but a close-up shows you they're all connected with these little bars, which were cut out of with the dual-edged X-Acto knife, and then cut in between with scissors. So I've been doing more black pieces, black and gray, which I migrate towards very easily. but they've been selling well, so that's why I'm doing them. I just feel like I can come up with a wealth of designs to keep these guys going, you know. I love the idea of just going into the studio and just pulling out my notebook, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes, and just having the freedom to do whatever I want to. Now I do commissions also, but not that many that it prevents me from just going into the studio. And this piece was especially a surprise because when I first printed it and cut it, I thought, I don't know, this doesn't look like too much, but I love this piece. This is like one of my favorite pieces right now. So it just, you know, looks so much more. And I should point out, the panels here are really overlapping. There's 3 panels along the top. When I print the wall hangings, I get 6 panels. So there's 3 panels along the top, overlapping 3 more right under them, so that you get more complexity happening. Now, you have the freedom to just arrange all 6, you know, and one here, one here, one here. But you don't have to do it. You can do this overlapping thing. And that's the nice thing about them, is that you don't have to set it up the way I set it up. You have the freedom to use your imagination. I give you how I did it, but you can rearrange it. I just masking tape the panels up onto the wall until I get an arrangement I like, and then that's what I use. So you can do the same. So in this case, I'm not using those little bars cut out by dual-edged X-Acto knife. I'm doing less and less of the dual-edged X-Acto knife because it ruined my hands. You have to press so hard for those. So I'm trying to do designs that don't require the X-Acto knife. There's one like this over in the other room in different colors. So in a close-up, I consider myself more of a designer than an artist. I like to design. I have no big message to give you in these pieces. Only I like things that are beautiful, and I try to make, you know, one as beautiful as the next, but it doesn't always work out. It's like, you know, some designs work better than others, of course. So, and you can see the colors go from light to dark, which I neglected to point that out at the beginning, but they do go through a color change, which is a nice feature because it looks like a shadow kind of image behind if you want that effect. And here we are, down to, this is sort of my talk here, so I include freehand in the picture. And then I have a little gallery up in Sebastopol that I show at. And it's a sort of housewares, well-designed housewares, and she has art on the wall. And this is a few of the notations I made. You know, I went all the way through that Victoria and Albert Museum. I had books of just little designs that sort of intrigued me as I was looking at the ceramics or the engraving on silverware or whatever. And then I take these and I use them in a larger format of a wall hanging or a garment or a scarf. And then there's always nature, which inspires, and again, it's like drawing. It sort of sharpens your eye to design. So the camera can become useful for design. And then a period of time that I really like is the arts and crafts movement, which was 1880 to 1910. And it mainly started in England, although it sort of went European and US wide. And it was a period which I think we're still sort of harking back to in a lot of respects, because it was the time when the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and it sort of kicked out all the people who were making things by hand and changed, that whole world changed into making things by machine. And there were people like William Morris and Macintosh, this designer up in Rennie, I think his name was Rennie Macintosh up in Scotland, who were doing things from hand, designing things that they would use in a house, that they would design, actually. They would design the whole house or the whole interior of a building and do the wallpaper and the drapes, you know, and the furniture. I mean, everything was, and I feel like we're kind of lost in that we've lost that sense of design, let alone making it from hand. So that's why this time is so important for me to remember. And this is a church that's in Berkeley by Bernard Maybach, who, it's the Christian Science Church, if you want to look it up. It's a gorgeous example of Eastern influence design and European design. They give tours through this church. Just to get back a little to my work, these are scarves which I I think of them as little experiments to try and push the technique further, and I'm trying different layers of textures, applying different things to the screen in order to keep the dye from bleeding. I now have a few things that I can use to keep the dyes from spreading out, and so it becomes more like a watercolorist would approach the technique. So you don't have to have those resist lines to hold the dye in place. You can use it, you can use water and it's called a stop flow to keep the dyes from moving around. And so here's some texture things, color, mixing colors. These are completely different than those wall hangings, but they're still like, I get to try out different things, experiment. I'm still in that experimental state when I do these scarves. Then these are all examples of that stop flow without the resist line around the colors and more of a painterly effect in the purple flowers and like that. And these designs, I can just go into the studio just like my wall hangings and try out different things, whatever appeals to me. And so before I sew up the scarves, I pull from the scarves and do these sort of collage-like layered tops that I've been, these are all sewn. This is so much sewing compared to the wall hangings, which are all cut. I'd rather cut than sew. But then I can't get something like these. So these are like wearing a scarf, like wearing a cloud. They're very light and wonderful to wear. Here's my interior of my studio. Print boards, that long arm you see with the handle sticking up there, that's a one-arm squeegee there. And basically you bring that blue arm down and you can walk it across the screen with a squeegee on the arm, attached to the arm. So that means I can print a very large, and there's a counterweight on the other side so that I can stand here and, are you a screen printer? No, you're just following me. Oh, okay, so.
I've never seen that.
Okay, so then you can lower it down onto the screen and just walk it across the screen, because it has these gliders, like ball bearings, that just go along that pipe at the bottom there. And it's a wonderful thing for printing. They used to do large billboards this way. I mean, really large billboards, like 20, 30 feet long. They'd have a one-arm squeegee along a pipe that long on one side of the table and walk a squeegee down the table. So, but this is a petite one compared to that. So I thought I'd just show you that I don't only spend my time in my studio, but I love to cook. And my husband is a writer, a creative writer, humorous writing, and he designed this house for us. And it's all done in the arts and crafts time period. And he did just a wonderful job. So I live in beauty as well as make it sometimes. So, and then I love to garden, and that's a very slow process. And I want to do more gardening, so I get more of our food from the garden. But that's very slow process. And then just at the end here, I want to mention, if you're not familiar with the Surface Design Association, these are people who paint and print on fabric. And I worked for this organization for about 25 years, both as a volunteer and as an employee. I learned a lot. I met a lot of wonderful people through it. And I feel like it's an organization worth supporting if you're a surface designer. They put out this gorgeous publication, Surface Design Journal, and they have a really nice website. They put on conferences every couple of years. So, then I also volunteer at the Textile Arts Council at the De Young as the treasurer there, because I learned so much through surface design. I'm just transferring it over. And then I put on a fiber show at our local art center. So I feel like it's important to do these other services too. So that with that, that's kind of the end of my talk. If you have any questions. So, yes.
Are you taking questions?
Yes.
So it seemed like a lot of the things you showed us were two-dimensional. You know, they were designs on fabric.
Yeah.
But is that your piece on
Yes,
the wall?
yes.
Okay. So it seems like when you showed us in your studio, there was a lot of three-dimensional stuff where your design elements really gained a whole dimension. So I'm wondering, when did that shift happen?
At the
Because I don't know, if that's more contemporary, that the things you do right now are more three-dimensional in depth.
Yes.
So I'm just curious about the sculptural aspect of it.
It happened, God, I don't know how many years. I think it was 90s, in the 90s sometime, where I was doing those banner like wall hangings, and then I decided I needed to do something more dimensional with the textiles than just have them flat banners. So that's when I became more dimensional with the pieces, with the wall hangings. The garments and the scarves all stay pretty much flat. It's working with flat pieces. Thank you all for coming. Yeah. So.